Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is scholar and historian Cody Groat. Cody, who is Mohawk and a band member of Six Nations of the Grand River, is an assistant professor in history and Indigenous studies at Western University. In June 2023, Cody ran for the NDP in the federal by-election in Oxford in southern Ontario, placing third in the longtime Conservative stronghold. He has a number of published works, including his first book, Canadian Stories, a teenage adventure with presidents, drag queens, and drug lords in 2016. His next book, Always a Part of the Land, the Federal Commemoration of Indigenous Peoples, is slated to be published in June 2026. Cody, thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Thank you for having me.
We spoke with you quite recently about the return of the artifacts from the Vatican, and I wanted to start there because it seems like you know quite a bit about how they came to be in the possession of the Catholic Church. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So those specific cultural ancestors entered the hands of the Catholic Church and the Vatican in the lead up to a very consequential museum exhibit in 1925, 100 years ago, the purpose of which was to allegedly celebrate the successes of Catholic missionary endeavors and the role of the Catholic Church around the world. And of course, the successes of the Catholic Church meant very different things for Indigenous peoples as it did for the Church itself. But we believe, quite reasonably, that this is just the tip of the iceberg for the cultural ancestors that are in the hands of the Vatican. I believe that this is probably the beginning of a much larger journey towards the repatriation of items back to our sovereign Indigenous territories here.
Any idea why maybe these were the items that were selected?
I mean, the Vatican at this point in time, the Catholic Church at this point in time, was very involved in the advancement of the Indian Act to ban specific cultural practices, at least specifically for status Indians. And they had this vital role in the advancement of the Indian residential school system. So when we're looking at some of these cultural ancestors that were part of the exhibit and that have since been returned, we see a mix of both ceremonial items that are quite culturally significant, as well as more practical items that might convey sort of the day-to-day practices of Indigenous nations in that period of the early 1900s. So the Vatican probably wanted to assemble quite a range that in their mind would tell the story of Indigenous peoples. But again, this was presented in such a way to exoticize Indigenous peoples and to really relegate our cultural practices to a lower standard, so to speak, than the Catholic Church.
Can you talk a bit about the significance of their return and what they could mean for the nations and peoples they're coming home to?
I think time and again, what we're seeing in the commentary and in the welcoming back of these is that they're not just artifacts in the way that we might perceive a museum artifact at, say, the Canadian Museum of History, behind a glass display case in a climate-controlled vault. What we're seeing is that these are cultural ancestors, and that really addresses or reflects the practices of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, especially when these cultural items are made from animate objects, trees or bark or animal hides, for instance. They have a life of their own. That life continues for a lot of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples into those cultural items. And that's why we see a lot of references to these being cultural ancestors. When these ancestors were exiting the plane when they first returned to Canada, we saw elders and knowledge keepers engaging in ceremony. And as I've been saying in some of my commentary, it's quite likely that these cultural ancestors might decay in the months and years ahead. They might not remain in the same condition as they were in the Vatican collections, but that's also fine. They're reclaiming their role they have in the continuation of our culture, and that's going to be something that should be celebrated and acknowledged as meaningful.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting when Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami had their press conference there with the kayak earlier this week, and they were like, you know, able to tell perhaps what hand the person used to make the kayak there. It was pretty interesting stuff.
And I think what we see that where in some instances, we know so fundamentally which lineages or which family groups or which nations were the ones who stewarded or cared for or actively utilized these cultural items. But then we've also seen in some other instances as well where that cultural knowledge has essentially a barricade has been erected between that knowledge and community members and these cultural ancestors because of the systems and the structures that were in place to actively try to separate us from those cultural practices. I did see it was quite fascinating how ITK had this very open and transparent audience, so to speak, with the cultural ancestors and the prime minister and the governor general. But we're seeing the Assembly of First Nations, for instance, taking a bit more of a subtle approach. And I think we're going to see over time different communities engaging in this process in different ways.
For sure. Repatriation, not just from the Vatican, but museums and universities, has been pretty slow. How do you view that ongoing process?
It isn't, I've critiqued the federal government, provincial, territorial governments, for instance, and post-secondary institutions like my own, Western University, for the timeline in which they've been engaging in these processes. For the longest time, it was just because there was that reluctance to surrender the power, so to speak, and to return these items or to take any blame for claiming these items fraudulently. But we've also seen there are some cultural reasons why these barriers exist. So I know, for instance, that for some communities associated with Six Nations of the Grand River, for instance, some of the nations, there's the recognition in part that there should be certain ceremonial practices that welcome these cultural ancestors back to our territories. That removal from our territories, there wasn't necessarily culture associated with that removal or ceremony associated with that removal. And welcoming them back, similarly, there has to be processes in place that take time, that take engaged conversation with various people in the nation to develop a system that really does reflect how these ancestors should be welcomed back. So at times, the slowness or the hesitancy is imposed by museums or federal governments. At times, it's nations recognizing we need to do this in a way that is culturally relevant, and that might take time on our end as well.
I think, this is being viewed as a pretty important moment. As a historian and academic in Indigenous studies, what are some of the things in the news cycle that you pay particular attention to?
Next week or this month, December 2025, is the 10th anniversary of the final report of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think that's going to be consequential for us to consider because for the past decade, the final report of the TRC has really dictated that relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples. I think obviously we saw Prime Minister Justin Trudeau really embraced that rhetoric, maybe not so much acted upon it, but he embraced the rhetoric of TRC quite explicitly. I think Prime Minister Mark Carney is less actively associating himself with that rhetoric of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it will be worthwhile to me to look at this new tenure of our new prime minister, moving on past that 10th anniversary of the final report of the TRC and seeing if it has that same significance in the year or years ahead is one thing I'll be interested in.
Yeah, Cody, as a historian, where do you think things are 10 years later, especially when there seems to be this rise of denialism going on around the TRC and all of that as well?
The retrenchment of Indian residential school denialism is impossible to ignore. And I think it's a rise of misogyny. I think it's a rise of white supremacy. I think it's not standing in isolation, and I think that's important for us to recognize as well. I still like to think of myself as being fairly young, and we look for the generations of men who are younger than me as well. The rise in misogyny is getting notably worse on these various online or internet cultures, and I don't think that we can separate necessarily some of those conversations with the entrenchment of residential school denialism. But when it comes to the rights of Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples 10 years later, I would personally argue that we have seen some successes, some growth, so to speak. But I think as well, repeating an answer I gave just a moment ago, when we see a new prime minister in office, I think some of that embedding reconciliation so clearly in the language is going to take a step back as well from a policy perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how things develop.
Cody, much more to talk about here. We just need to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Cody Groat, an associate professor of history and Indigenous studies at Western University in Ontario. Cody, we were talking about the TRC and where things are at, I guess, in our current history. And as a history professor, are there things that you think might be shaping history right now, or that people might be talking about decades from now?
One thing that's standing out to me, because I always try to look at that intersection between history and political affairs, which are two of my interests, is our recent shift towards pipelines. I think is an interesting development that we're starting to see again. I think that we are perhaps not taking the very significant concerns of environmental degradation as seriously as we should be. There is this desire to address potential Albertan separatism, for example, where I think we might be catering a bit to some of those economic realities associated with pipelines, cultivating some of that. And I think if we don't take a step and really recognize how detrimental that will be, we are going to be talking about this for years and generations to come. I really think as well the Prime Minister might not be as aware about the pushback he is going to receive. I think he's already going to try to gently step back the memorandum of understanding regarding pipelines. So I think that's one thing I'm keeping an eye out, that intersection with history and politics in relation to that specific issue.
Is there a way to really know if you're living in a historic moment that's going to be in textbooks 50 years from now?
I would argue we're always living in one of those moments. But, I even think just before COVID, one of the things that I thought was one of the most consequential things in relation to contemporary Indigenous issues was these protests associated with pipelines. We were blockading, highly consequential railroad networks between Toronto and Montreal, shutting down some of these very significant transportation corridors to combat this movement towards erecting pipelines. And then that month, we see COVID around the world shutting down, quite literally, the world. And all of a sudden, this story that I thought was so consequential to the future of us as a nation shifted to something that was so incredibly more consequential. So it is hard to know the moment when you're in it. I would say that for sure.
Yeah, wow, interesting. Cody, wanted to talk about some of your written work, as it's been nearly 10 years since you self-published your first book. Plus, you have another one coming up in just a couple months. So let's start with your first, titled Canadian Stories, A Teenage Adventure with Presidents, Drag Queens, and Drug Lords. A heck of a title. You spoke with prime ministers, astronauts, authors, television personalities. How did this all come to be?
I was working for my school newspaper at the time, the campus newspaper for Wilfrid Laurier University's Brantford campus, and I learned of this guy who had the world record for losing the most elections ever. And I really wanted the chance to interview him, but the editor of my campus paper said, no, not happening. So I, had this loose idea. I was going to interview him. I thought I would create a blog. These days, it'd probably be a podcast where I could interview this man and write about the experience. And I just really enjoyed the opportunity to get to talk to this man and learn a bit of his story. And from there, I had the chance to speak to others from my hometown. So I grew up in Ingersoll, Ontario, which is where I am now. Somebody who also went to the same high school as me, Jeremy Hansen, is an astronaut, and he's actually going to the moon in February 2026. So I reached out to Jeremy, interviewed him, and from there, it just sort of kept on developing quite naturally. And I think it was 8 or 9 months later, I was interviewed interviewing former Prime Minister Paul Martin in his office in Montreal. And I think that gave me a little bit of legitimacy to reach out to some of those bigger names I was able to speak to. So it was just a small thing that grew exponentially.
Have any of those interviews really stuck with you a decade later?
There's quite a few, and I always look back and I've seen how these people's lives have developed since I've met them. So, Michael Stark and Michael Leshner, the first same-sex legally married couple in Canada, that was a great opportunity to spend some time with them and get to hear their very highly consequential story. Former Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci, when I interviewed him, I didn't know 10 years ago that he was the negotiator of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. I would have loved to ask him about that, but sort of my touch points of knowledge 10 years ago aren't the same as what they are now. I had the chance to interview the former president of Latvia, Vairvik Faberja, who moved to Canada as a teenager, as a displaced person, and that was quite significant. And then, of course, I always tell people how I once interviewed Dan Aykroyd, and that's something that stays with me. So.
Yeah, no kidding. You were quite literally a teenager when you started the book and self-published it. Was it mind-blowing to you to be getting to speak with Dan Aykroyd and prime ministers and Supreme Court justices?
It really was. And, I still live in the hometown I grew up in. And I think that hometown interest behind the project really helped inspire me to keep going. I would write my chapters at our local coffee culture, which doesn't exist anymore. But, and even when I was at Laurier's Brantford campus, when I was 17, 18, writing this, my former professors who are now colleagues in the profession would tell me to just leave class for the day when I had an interview with Kim Campbell or something along those lines. And, that really spoke to, that support I had from them was really meaningful as the project continued. And now I think it does shape my approach to being a university professor as well, because when I see students who have these passion projects, I really try to cultivate them to the best I can, because, not too long ago, I was that student as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you not to go interview Paul Martin so you can finish up your homework there.
Exactly.
Another super interesting project you've been working on is an oral history with 100 Indigenous living recipients of the Order of Canada. Why was that a project you wanted to take on?
That's been one that's taken a little bit of a back burner, but I'm really going to revisit it in the coming months or years. I would say it stemmed quite naturally from that book, Canadian Stories, I was writing. The motto of the Order of Canada that you see on all of the medals is "They desire a better country." And one thing that stood out to me is the better country that some Indigenous peoples might desire is not the same better country that a nationalist Canadian might envision, for instance. I know when Cindy Blackstock received the Order of Canada many years ago, and I haven't had a chance to speak with her yet, but there was a story that said somebody who had fought against the government of Canada was receiving the Order of Canada. Same with Bev Jacobs, another person. There was this language being used, and I don't think I necessarily agreed with that interpretation, but it showed some of those dichotomies between what we are envisioning when we receive or awarded this state honor. So I had the chance to have some really great conversations. The artist Alex Janvier, for instance, before he passed away, the author Lee Miracle, before she passed away, were some really interesting people I spoke to for that. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But of course, some of the people I interviewed a few years ago for that have since had their identity questioned as well as Indigenous people. So that's one of the problems with projects as they develop over time.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, a project you do have coming that's already ready for pre-order is a book coming in June of 2026 called Always a Part of the Land, the Federal Commemoration of Indigenous Histories. What can you tell us about that book?
So that book came from my PhD research. It looks at something called the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. This is a federal agency that's been around since 1919, and its purpose is to provide official recommendations to the Government of Canada on the commemoration of national historic people, national historic sites, and national historic events. And a common theme associated with all of my projects is this idea that national significance for the Canadian state means quite different things in relation to significance ascribed by Indigenous peoples. We look at the individuals who have been recognized by the Government of Canada as National Historic People, and it's often Indigenous peoples whose narratives have been co opted, I would say, by the Government of Canada to support this mythology that Canada tells about itself. And the sites that have been recognized as National Historic Sites of Canada, we see fur trade forts, for instance, or we see Indigenous peoples only referenced in relation to archaeological sites, the places that are meaningful to us for fundamentally different reasons in the Government of Canada haven't really been commemorated. So this project looked at all of the ways in which Indigenous nations have contested Canada's idea of what is important or what is significant. And it also shows the ways that the Government of Canada has kind of massaged narratives about the past to advance a story that's meaningful to them.
Interesting stuff. As I mentioned, you can pre-order now. Cody, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for one last break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is historian and academic Cody Groat. And Cody also ran for the federal NDP, as we mentioned, in a by-election in 2023, placed third in a riding long held by the Conservatives. What caused you to want to run for office?
So Oxford County is where I've called home for my entire life, and it is a community that's really quite meaningful to me. I grew up in geared to income housing, and I had the opportunity to benefit from a lot of social supports here in the county, and the time just felt right for me to run for office. The incumbent member of parliament who retired had been in office since the year I was born, so it had been quite a significant amount of time he held the seat. And there was a lot of causes I really felt were meaningful for me to promote. And, I threw my hat in, and the result was the result.
Any thoughts on potentially running again?
I would say not anytime soon. It's definitely an interesting time to see federal politics in Canada rolling out. I think the divisiveness is really getting more and more intensified. I noticed that in Oxford during the federal by-election in 2023, what is, for the most part, a community that's quite close-knit, we saw federal tactics towards quite divisive politics being introduced in that campaign, and it was later reflected quite significantly on the national stage. And I think there's work you can do in a community without necessarily being in Parliament.
Yeah, indeed. Well, the House of Commons is currently now on its 6-week break. I'm sure you would have liked that had you got voted in. It wrapped up. The Liberals gained, one more riding in the in the House of Commons, but still one seat away from a majority. Only one bill passed during that whole time as well. What will you be watching for and expecting in the coming year?
And it's quite a consequential bill, some of the things that the Carney government's trying to introduce, some of these major project legislation and some of these nation-building incentives. And as I argued when Carney was running to be prime minister, nation-building the Canadian nation-state by necessity subsumes competing claims to Canadian nationalism, like the nationalisms of Indigenous peoples. So again, I'll be curious to see how federal nation-building it includes Indigenous nations or tries to erase their active participation, which I think we've seen a bit. And it'll be interesting to see how these questions of Alberta sovereignty movements and the rise of notwithstanding clause legislation in Quebec and Alberta. I think there's some very consequential nationalist questions coming up in the new year.
Like you say, Cody, historic times indeed. Really appreciate you taking some time for us this week on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all the time we have for Face to Face this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, or our APTN News YouTube page. All of our episodes of Face to Face are also available as podcasts, and you can find those wherever you choose to download your audio. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech, thanks for being with us. We'll see you back here in 7 days.